Here's something I read in a novel by John Kinney. The novel is called Truth in Advertising. It's an interaction between the main character, who's the narrator, and Phoebe, the woman he loves. And I'll just read it to you. I say, one beautiful thing. Phoebe says, I've got a good one. It's a thing we do every day, well, most days. We have to describe a beautiful thing we saw that day, one beautiful human interaction. She says, so this kid gets on the train, tough looking, wearing this baggy suit. He sits across from this dandyish guy. You get the sense the kid has a job interview or something. He has a tie around his neck. He starts trying to tie it, but it's obvious the kid has no idea how to do it. The dandy's watching the kid, says something to him in Spanish. I'm thinking there's going to be a fight. Only the kid says something back, sort of meek. The dandy says something and the kid hands him the tie. The guy ties it, talking the whole time, undoes it, ties it again, and then hands it to the kid. Dandy got off at the next stop. I love New York. That's really nice. Phoebe says, you? I can't think of anything. It takes me several seconds, but it comes to me sharp and clear. I was walking to the subway this morning, and there's one of those ready, willing, and able guys, former homeless people just out of prison. The city puts them to work sweeping and cleaning. He's swapping out a huge bag of trash, and there's this homeless guy sleeping in a corner by a subway grate. The cleaning guy walks up to him. I'm sure he's going to wake him up, tell him to move on, except he takes his jacket off, this uniform jacket, and puts it over the guy. Phoebe says, I like that. See, you just have to look. Beauty is everywhere. I like that too. We are, in fact, supposed to look for beautiful things. And there is, in fact, beauty all around us. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Philippians and said, I'd say you'll do your best by filling your minds and meditating on things true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not things to curse. We are to fill our minds. We are to meditate on beautiful things. So with that as a backdrop, I want to offer in kind of a simple way, I think, 4 beautiful thoughts. At least they're beautiful thoughts to me. And I hope that though I'll kind of theorize a little bit and talk about some concepts, that by the time I finish my talk today, that this will have some practical meaning for your life. The first thought I want to offer is that beauty is in fact everywhere. Now, it's interesting to consider what beauty is. And though I'll try to speak to the question, and though I think Christian did a great job treating this last week, I will say that I think beauty ultimately is indefinable. Beauty is something that we know when we experience it, but it's really hard to describe it. Beauty is often something that pleases our aesthetic senses, such as sight or hearing. Aesthetic beauty, of course, is that which is pleasurable to the physical senses. And a lot of times when we talk about beauty, we're talking about that which pleases our aesthetic senses. But I think it's more. It's more because the most beautiful things please our intellectual and moral senses as well. Edmund Burke, an Irishman who was an intellectual force behind the American Revolution, wrote a book on aesthetics called A Philosophical Inquiry into Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. And he argued, as have many before and since, that there is a great deal of commonality in what people find beautiful. And I agree. But particularly where the intellectual and moral sense of beauty is experienced. There is a subjective dimension to beauty. Those things of which we would say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But then there is an objective beauty where most human beings would agree that something is beautiful. And that objective beauty arises not so much from the physical senses, but from the spiritual senses. Our mind, our soul seems to agree as human beings as to what is actually beautiful. So, I've used this illustration before. I would find nearly everything about a baseball game at Yankee Stadium beautiful. Notice I didn't say Citi Field, I said Yankee Stadium. I find nearly everything about a game at Yankee Stadium beautiful. The shouts of the vendors, the cut of the grass, the sound of a ball popping a glove, the crack of the bat, and so on. But there are some who sadly are not interested in sports and not interested in baseball in general, and tragically, if they are not Yankee fans. They would not be captivated by a baseball game, even at Yankee Stadium. But if that person were sitting there with a person that they love, a friend, family, experiencing time together that's relational, then everyone would agree that that is beautiful. Do you understand? Yankee Stadium is a subjective beauty, but two human beings interacting in a meaningful way is objective beauty. So several years ago, I was invited to a game at Yankee Stadium by the Yankees chaplain Willie Alfonso when we were in a suite, and I invited my daughter to attend with me. My daughter couldn't care about baseball at all. But our time that day, as we sat there having conversation with the game really as a backdrop, was beautiful, and anybody in the world would judge that as beautiful. So beauty is more than a subjective physical quality. It is at its best a moral quality that somehow pleases the human spirit. Let's say it like this: beauty is more than a physical aesthetic. Real beauty reflects what is good and true. And this is why I believe, as do many, that the most beautiful things in our lives come from God, point to God, and reflect God. Another way to get at this is Jonathan Edwards, often considered the greatest philosopher in American history. When he talked about beauty, he talked about secondary beauty and primary beauty. And I don't want to totally put you to sleep this early in the sermon, but I find it interesting and I think it's actually important. Secondary beauty would be something that has been created and that exists in the physical world. Something created either by God or by a human being made in God's image who has creative power. So he would call that secondary beauty, whether that's a beautiful mountain or a majestic piece of art. He says primary beauty is love between two beings who have free will. And this is where you would say that secondary beauty might be the game at Yankee Stadium. Primary beauty would be the relationship that I experience in that moment with my daughter. Primary beauty would be helping a homeless person in a subway, like Kenny's novel talked about, or tying the tie of a stranger on a train. That is primary beauty. One's relationship with God would be considered primary beauty. And then I take it a little bit further and I talk about ultimate beauty, because I think ultimately both secondary beauty and primary beauty point to ultimate beauty, and ultimate beauty is God. I believe that every truly good and beautiful thing comes from God, finds its origin in God, and therefore beauty, in however we see it, subjectively or objectively, secondarily, primarily, points to this ultimate reality of a beautiful God. And we'll dig into that a little bit more in a moment. But let me just close this section by saying we can find beauty everywhere if we pay attention. Sadly, we too often focus on the ugliness in this world, and we don't pay enough attention to the beauty in this world. And sometimes people will ask the question, and rightfully so. It's a question we openly address here. Why would God allow such ugliness in this world? But the other question, of course, is why would God have created such beauty? And what we're asked to do, even to affect the ugliness, is to focus on the beauty, to fill our minds with the beauty, to meditate on beautiful things. The Washington Post several years ago did an experiment to try to test whether or not beauty could transcend the normal interactions of human life. And they got the most accomplished violinist in America, a guy named Joshua Bell. Joshua Bell won the Avery Fisher Prize as the best classical musician in America. And they got Joshua Bell to dress like a normal guy and to position himself just outside the metro, the public transportation system in Washington, D.C. And they had him play for 43 minutes early in the morning during the commuting time. And he played a $3.5 million Stradivarius violin for 43 minutes, performed 6 classical pieces, and 1,097 people passed by, and only 7 of those people stopped to pay attention. They were walking by a violinist who normally gets paid about $1,000 an hour to play his instrument. And they would have, most of them probably paid a lot of money to buy a ticket to go hear this guy play. But in the busyness of their life, hurrying to work, trying to stay on schedule, they didn't notice the beauty that they almost stumbled over on their way to work. This is true, I think, of most of us. We think perhaps a lot of times a discussion about something like this is irrelevant, and it actually is not irrelevant. And it doesn't have to be a violin. It could be the beauty of a conversation with your child, the smell of the flowers in your backyard, holding hands with someone who loves you, or a work of art that you pass every day and never stop to experience. A wonderful thing that happened to me and Sharon last summer is we spent some time in Rome, as most of you know, and just outside our hotel, and what we learned was a very famous square in front of one of the oldest churches in Rome. A celloist would show up every day and play for several hours. Well, we were on my study intensive, so I was spending a lot of time on the roof of this hotel reading about the Apostle Paul, which I just taught everything. I'm out of stuff. Anyway. But I would sit up there on the roof of this thing. Truly, while I was there, I was particularly studying Paul and reading through the book of Romans, and I could see the Pantheon in the distance, and I could hear this celloist down there. And because we had slowed down from the normal business of life, we paid attention, and Sharon particularly became mesmerized with this celloist. I started to worry about all the time she was spending down there. Thankfully, he wasn't nearly as good looking as I am, but anyway, he had hair, which is a turnoff to her. But we still listened to this. It turns out this was a famous celloist who decided that he loved playing in the street, and it was absolutely fabulous. But we took time and listened and bought his CDs and still listen to him and all that stuff. CDs, are there such a thing? Yes, actually we are. But if I would have, let's face it, if I were walking late to an appointment in the New York City subway, and in my normal life I wouldn't have filled my mind with the beauty of a violinist or a celloist, or paid attention to art, or looked at the flowers, or noticed interactions between human beings that were beautiful, and so on. Beauty is all around. We are supposed to pay attention with it. Here's my second thought. It's that, and I've already alluded to this, that beauty points to a beautiful God. Could I have just a touch more monitor, please? Thank you. Beauty points to a beautiful God. Beauty gives us a sense that there is some meaning, some purpose to life. Arthur C. Danto, the art critic at The Nation, once described a work of art that gave him a sense of obscure but inescapable meaning. He said that great art always gives you a sense that life is not a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. There's something about beauty that gives us a sense that there's something more, that perhaps there's meaning. Again, it's something we don't necessarily consciously think about, but our soul somehow grasps this. Here's what the Apostle Paul said to the Romans. He said, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." Now that's, complex in a sense, but it's simple as well. He basically says we somehow see God's invisible quality in things that have been made. And I believe that the things that have been made are either things that God created, or this is very important and people miss this, or something that was made by a person created in the image of God and given creative capacity. I think that when we make things that are beautiful, that we are fulfilling part of our purpose as human beings. We were created to create. And so suffice it to say, what we experience when we see a thing that has been made, again, God's creation of a sunset or a beautiful work of art, somehow or another, we see God's invisible qualities in a thing that can be seen. That's why even someone who may not be a believer, perhaps the critic at The Nation, somehow experiences some awareness that life must mean something when he stands and looks at a beautiful piece of art, because though he doesn't know it, God is communicating his divine nature through that physical thing that has been made. So this is why it's commonly understood that beauty uncovers a longing for something more. Beauty uncovers a longing for something more. Abraham Heschel, one of the leading Jewish theologians and philosophers of the 20th century, wrote something I've referred to a number of times. He said, "A work of art introduces us to emotions which we have never cherished before. Great works produce rather than satisfy needs by giving the world fresh cravings." In other words, he's saying, when we see something that's beautiful and it touches something in us, it doesn't necessarily satisfy a need. It causes us to crave something more. And that's a wonderful thing to consider. Augustine argued in the Confessions basically this, that if a need exists, or if a craving exists, it exists because the thing being craved for exists. So in other words, are you still awake? Physical hunger, pardon me as I go off on things I enjoy thinking about and maybe no one else in the world does, but I'll try to make it practical in a moment. So the fact of physical hunger points to the fact that there's something that exists that satisfies physical hunger. So physical hunger exists because food exists. Physical thirst exists because water exists. Sexual desire exists because sex exists, according to Augustine, who liked to talk about such things. Tiredness exists because the ability to sleep exists. The desire, the craving for relationships exist because the possibility of relationships exist. And so it is that a desire, the craving for beauty exists because God exists. This is what Augustine would have argued. What we long for, the craving we experience when we see the beautiful thing, that craving is there because the thing that's being craved actually exists. And so when Heschel says, the Jewish philosopher and theologian, that great works of art produce cravings, the question is, what is it that we crave? What is it that we long for there? C.S. Lewis, who most of you will be familiar with, the great Oxford professor, atheist turned believer, and Christian apologist, in his book, The Weight of Glory, he said, "We do not want merely to see beauty, though. God knows that even that is bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it." And then in his book, Till We Have Faces, one of my favorite quotes on this subject, C.S. Lewis said, "The sweetest thing in all my life has been the longing to find the place where all the beauty came from." Essentially, he says that part of the reason he came to faith in God is because beauty caused him to long for something more. And he said, the sweetest thing in my life is when I longed the most to find the place where all the beauty come from. Well, what kind of God would create beauty? What kind of God would give us the capacity to create beauty? What kind of God would use beauty to call us to himself? The answer is a beautiful God. I love these passages in the Psalms. Psalm 90, verse 17, "Let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us." Psalm 27:4, "One thing I ask from the Lord," David wrote, "this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple." Or the 50th Psalm, "From Zion," or where God lives, "from Zion, perfect in beauty, God shines forth." A guy named John Donahue said that another name for God is beauty. The fact is, we worship a beautiful God who satisfies in us the craving we have for more. Here's my third thought. And now I'll hopefully get a little more practical. It's that beauty is useful. Beauty is useful. And I'm gonna dig in just for a few minutes into some things that I explore in a chapter in my book, The Hospitable Leader, that's kind of tucked in the back of the section on communication. And I encourage you, if you've not read that chapter, I encourage you to, because it has the ability, and this is where I really lay some of this stuff out, to make a incredible impact on someone's life. I've heard stories just this week of people who are changing the way they do business because of this chapter on beauty, and how beauty creates an environment where people's hearts are warm and you can lead them to something more, whether that's buying your product or whether that's telling them about Jesus. And I also realize there are a lot of folks who are new to TLCC who don't even know that I've ever written a book. And in fact, I'm 6 months away from launching a new book. And I encourage you to pick it up. And if you do, in our resource lounge, I'd love to sign it for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, just something that might be nice for you guys to know. And this is the kind of thing I always hesitate to talk about this kind of stuff, but this is really our story. You know, The Hospitable Leader is a book that's trying to describe the culture that has attracted so many people like you, such a diversity of people who want to do life together and journey together and so on and so forth. And you know, this has gotten a lot of interest around the country. And one of the things that's just kind of fun, that might be fun for you to know, that I don't know, these kind of thing, I don't know if I say this in the next service, but one of my dreams has always been to walk by an airport bookstore and to see one of my books. I've dreamed about that for years and years and years. And all of a sudden I'm hearing from people all over the country. They're sending me texts and so on and so forth and pictures of seeing this book about us, about this church in the DFW airport and JFK. Somebody sent me a thing the other day, and somebody said they saw it in New Orleans. I think, James, you said you thought you saw it there. Somebody picked it up in Austin. Somebody so people are walking through airports and learning about the Life Christian Church, and it just occurs to me, this is one of the ways that we have the privilege of spreading God's love in ever widening circles. It just makes me very happy, and I'm grateful. So one of the things I discuss is that beauty is useful, and I need to hurry now. Matthew tells an enchanting story in his gospel about something beautiful that happened to Jesus just a few days before his death. He was enjoying an unhurried dinner in the company of his friends, reclining at the table as was his custom, when a woman came to him with an elegant bottle of very expensive perfume and lovingly poured it on his head. It was an act, of course, of extravagant worship. But instead of being impressed by the reverent generosity of this woman, the disciples of Jesus were indignant. They said that this costly perfume had been wasted on Jesus, that it could have been sold at a high price, and the money that was made from the sale could have been used to serve the poor. Aware of their negative response to this gesture, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me." This is profound. Now, he went on to tell them that this perfume had been poured on his body to physically demonstrate what he'd been trying to tell them about his imminent death and burial, and that this woman's act would be used to tell his story around the world. So he basically says this beautiful thing she has done is useful, and he offers two reasons. One is, by her pouring this perfume on him, she was demonstrating something about his burial and the ointment that would be poured on his body after his burial. He'd been telling them about it, but this was an artistic way, if you please, of telling the story. And then secondly, he said, the fact she's done this is going to be used to tell my story for years to come. And here we are 2,000 years later. We're talking about this beautiful thing that this woman did for Jesus. I am struck by the fact that Jesus celebrated this woman for doing this lavishly beautiful thing, pouring this expensive perfume on his head, rather than what would have appeared to be the most useful thing, which was giving money to the poor. Now clearly, Jesus cared about the poor deeply, and throughout his ministry, he repeatedly emphasized our responsibility to take care of those who are in need, constantly. But in this case, he counted this extravagant act, this costly, expensive act, as a good deed. Some translations of this passage render "she has done a beautiful thing" as "she has done a good work," or "she has done a good deed." The word translated "good" or "beautiful" here intimates that what is beautiful is good. And from this story, we also get a hint that beauty can prove useful, especially in telling God's story. It occurs to me then that there are times when doing a beautiful thing, even an extravagant and expensive beautiful thing is the best way to do a good and useful things. So I'll comment on this in two ways. First, when we do beautiful things, beauty is good in and of itself. We might say that it's transcendently useful. I think I've already made this point, but I'll just briefly speak to it again. When we do beautiful things, it points people to ultimate beauty. It creates longing in their hearts for something more. And it creates environments where we can speak to the craving that is called up in people in the presence of beauty. Beauty is good in and of itself because it points to God. It honors God. It glorifies God. Therefore, beauty is good in and of itself. Secondly, though, we could say that beauty can be practically useful. So this woman who did this act, which was good in and of itself because it offered worship to Jesus, also did something practically useful because she demonstrated by this beautiful act something that Jesus had been saying, but which made the point in a way that was more memorable. And this is important. It's like the ballerina who danced a beautiful dance, and someone asked her later, well, what did the dance mean? And she said, if I could explain it, I wouldn't have had to dance it. There are some things that just have to be done. They have to be demonstrated. An artist can't describe the beauty of a sunset, but they can paint it in a way, right? That makes the point. And so this woman made a point that needed to be made by this beautiful act, and she also created the opportunity for this story to be told 2,000 years later. I think that a lot of times people, and Jesus celebrates, so the disciples of Jesus were on the pragmatic side of this discussion. And they were saying essentially, couldn't we have, it's amazing. Jesus has just received this wonderful thing, and they're upset at him because he let it happen. How much money did she spend on that perfume? And couldn't it have been sold? And couldn't we have gone and served the poor with it? This is a reasonable discussion, isn't it? But I just want you to hear how Jesus came down on it. She has done a beautiful, good thing for me. Leave her alone. Don't bother her. I think a lot of times the debate, all of us, and especially a church, has limited resources that we're called to steward properly in our lives. And a lot of times we have to make the decision between how we're going to allocate funds, and a lot of times doing beautiful things, thinking through it, doing something artistically cost a little bit more. And we have to ask the question, is this a worthy thing to do? Or should we do the obvious thing, and should we give this money to the poor? I think we all understand, and frankly, we wrestle with this question around here. And I think a lot of times we create an either or kind of thing when both and is the right way to go about it. Here's a story I've never told before. Because I tell it with trepidation. We'll see whether I talk about it next service or not. But right after we built this building, where we did something as beautiful as we possibly could within severe cost restraints. And Sharon, God bless her, has a gift. We brought this whole project in under budget. But she has a gift of taking $1 and stretching it like crazy. And you say, wow, I wonder what that would have cost. The fireplace, the light out here over the fireplace. The first time it was designed by the lighting guy, it was like $75,000. And I think she ended up getting it made for $1,000 or something crazy like that. It's ridiculous. It's something very close to those numbers. And this is true of everything in this building. We ended up with the thing that we wanted, but we paid a whole lot less. But we didn't settle to not have something beautiful. Do you understand? Well, soon after we built this building, we hosted on our property, we decided we were going to open a child development center in El Salvador. which we have done and which is going forward very well. It had a couple hiccups because there was a change of leadership at the church we were partnering with in El Salvador, but it's going great now. And Sharon and Kirsten and DeBrickashaw just got back, and Christiani just got back from there, and we got a trip going there this summer. Anyway, when we launched this whole thing, which demanded an investment of a lot of money, we hosted a compassion experience on our parking lot here at the 747 campus. And this is where Compassion came and sat up an experience where people could walk through this experience and learn what it's like for a child to live in poverty in a developing country. It was a powerful thing. We had over 3,000 people go through that experience. And we sponsored, along with other people, not a part of our church, over 200 children, which amounts to about $84,000 a year that's going to be going on for years and years and years and years. Very successful attempt to serve the needy. You hear me? Here comes the controversial part. During this experience that's been set up to serve the poor, a woman comes up to the offices, which were at that time were in the temporary offices which are about to get moved up on the parking lot, wanting to know who was responsible for the building. Well, this is very common. A lot of people come by. Churches, pastors bring people, tour their staff through here. We've got people are amazed by this beautiful place we have. And so I guess we thought it was one of those, and Sharon walked out to greet this woman who started off being very nice and saying, I just walked into your building, I guess to use a restroom actually, and it's so beautiful. And Sharon said, thank you, and was waiting for the person to follow through with something where Sharon could say, how can I serve you? But instead the woman starts trembling, angry. And for about, close to 10 minutes, she basically takes Sharon's head off. She was, as I remember right, a pastor's wife from someplace else. I probably shouldn't tell that much. And she said, how much did you pay for this? How could you have spent all for? We're lucky I didn't hear this. You could have, essentially she's saying, you could have given this much money to the poor. 20 feet behind her, there's a compassion experience taking up our entire parking lot, and we're sponsoring 200 children. In our previous building, I need to not raise my voice, in our previous building, we didn't have a parking lot, and we couldn't have done that. And the fact is, our investment in beauty has created an opportunity for us to serve the poor in ways multiplied beyond what we ever could have done otherwise. Don't think that there isn't a direct link between our attempt to do things beautifully and our investment in that, and the fact that our ever-widening circle Spread God's Love offering is going to end up probably being about $350,000 to invest in gospel expansion in all kinds of ways. Well, I say all of that to make a simple point. First of all, that's cathartic. I feel better. Thank you. It's unbelievable. But the Christian church, by and large in this country, is a utilitarian, over-the-top pragmatic. If it doesn't have particular use, it's not worth investing in. And here we say that the fact is, for 2,000 years in Christianity, beauty, until recently, when Christianity seems to celebrate ugly, Christianity has made an investment in beautiful things. I mean, when's the last time you went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and saw a painting painted by a well-known Christian painter? You see them. In fact, most of the beautiful art was painted, or at least for many hundreds and hundreds of years. Christianity, boy, I'm really sidetracked now, was driving beauty. What was Bach? Who was Beethoven? They were church musicians. Where did the beauty go? What happened to it? And see, we have a hunger here, which wasn't really my point today, but I might as well get it out while I'm standing here, to try within the constraints of our realities here to not just do a thing, but to somehow, by God's grace, and we're trying to learn how to do it better, to do it beautifully, because beauty is good in and of itself. It's good because it points to God, and it's good because it's useful. And so, here's my fourth thought. Man, I don't even know what I think about everything I just said, but fourth, beauty can continually be created. Let me close with this, and then we're going to invite our host to come to make comments, and we're going to say the benediction. In other words, we did all of our music up front today, and I just wanted to prepare you for the abrupt ending that's about to come. Now, I'll go another 30 minutes if you want me to, but I'm planning to close quickly. Beauty can continually be created. Here's a wonderful thought. I'll say it quickly. Genesis chapter 1 tells us, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Notice verse 2 says, now the earth was formless and empty. The fact is, there wasn't an earth, except in the mind of God. This is called a prolepsis. A prolepsis is the describing of an event as taking place before it could have done so, the treating of a future event as if it had already happened. Now, I know this is a lot, 40 minutes into a talk, but just hear me, because this is what I want to leave you with. God is hovering over essentially not nothingness, there's something there, but what's there is chaos. It's formless, it's void, it's ugly, it's dark. But in the mind of God, who's thinking proleptically, there is an earth. He sees what he's about to make, and then he takes action. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The Greeks called what God created the world, or the cosmos. Cosmos means order, arrangement, ornament, adornment. Cosmos had to do with order and beauty. Out of chaos, formlessness, and voidness, God created order and beauty. Again, it wasn't that there wasn't anything at all. There was something there, something that God was hovering over. But he had to act to bring beauty and order out of the chaos. Something was there, but it was a mess. God brought form and functionality and purpose. And then he created human beings to be stewards of what he made. This is what I say to you. Part of being created in the image of God is to be proleptic, which means we can see things before they exist, and then we can act to bring them into existence. We can look at chaos and see order. We can look at ugliness and see beauty, and then we can act to make it happen. We participate in God's continued creative activity in our world, whether in conceiving a child, designing a piece of art, developing a business, writing a curriculum for learning groups, or imagining new inventions. And all the things that we create point to the Creator and reflect his beauty. You do not, we do not, have to accept ugliness, whether in a landscape, a marriage, a community, because we have the potential to will and act and make something beautiful that reflects God's grandeur instead of humanity's mess. And we can bring change into our world in such a way that people catch their breath and marvel when they see something of God in what we've done. And I know that the obvious instinct is to think about reflecting beauty in terms of art, and few of us are artists in that way. But what is art to you? It may be an idea for a business that creates a wonderful environment for people to work in. Or perhaps it's an idea that when developed enhances and adds pleasure to people's lives, or an educational program that helps people learn in revolutionary new ways. We can create beautiful things in so many areas that can bring meaning and joy and which reflect a beautiful God. I encourage you to hover over the ugliness and see beauty. I encourage you in your life this week to hover, if you please, over chaos and see order. I encourage you to see an earth before there is such a thing, and then act in ways to make that thing happen. And so that's what I have to say today. Thank you.